To start, both my parents and I have grown up in a small southeastern town in Kentucky. The landscape is quite rural, and the actual city only has one stoplight in it, even in 2019. For the most part, the area is peaceful, and it feels as if everyone knows each other. While this story doesn't involve the paranormal, it is extremely terrifying. A real-life nightmare, if you will. The story begins on September 18, 1989 in the county's only high school. Both of my parents were teachers at this said school. My mother happened to be in her planning period and was sitting in her teacher's lounge with a few other personnel. Their planning was cut short when a fellow female teacher ran screaming immediately into the teacher's round, stating, "He's got a gun! He's got a gun!" Understandably, the teacher was too distressed to explain in detail and immediately ran screaming out of the lounge. Everyone immediately scrambled to escape or hide from the gunmen. My mother, a fellow teacher, and teacher's aide ran into a small closet and attempted to hide. The closet was tiny, and along with 3 small women currently occupying it, was also home to a fold-away bed. No matter how hard they tried to close the door, the bed kept getting in the way. They were afraid to open the door and shove the bed out, as it would be a dead giveaway that someone was in the closet. After the initial shock, things began to quiet down in the school. They could hear a few shots fired, but had no idea how close the gunfire was in proximity to them. They literally crammed like sardines in a hot closet, unsure when or if the shooter would come for them. Though they tried to remain silent, my mother did make a plea for their salvation, as it was almost certain they wouldn't make it out of the school alive. The time ticked away slowly, and after an hour of being in the closet, they began to hear footsteps. The footsteps were slowly coming down the hallway toward the room they were in. Soft sounds clicking as if someone was searching around the hallway. As they came closer, the footsteps stopped in the doorway of the teacher's lounge. It was almost as if they could feel a pair of eyes searching the room from top to bottom, looking for any sign of life. My mom and the other woman had their hands on the doorknob, trying to keep it closed as much as possible. They were almost certain this was the end. Suddenly, they heard the person walk away and enter a nearby bathroom. My father also had a free first block, so he was seated at his desk trying to catch up on grading student assignments. Suddenly, he heard a loud noise, which he said sounded like a large table falling over. He wondered at what the sound might be, but figured it was simply a table that had gotten knocked over or someone had dropped several textbooks. Unlike the teacher's lounge, my father's classroom was located upstairs in a smaller portion of the school. While he continued grading papers, he began to hear someone running down the hallway. It was a teacher that seemed to be searching through the classrooms. He stopped in the doorway and said, "One of the kids brought a gun and has taken hostages. We need to evacuate the other classmates immediately." My dad quickly said, "I'll take the right side of the hall and you take the left." They then set off running down the halls to notify teachers and students. However, most of the classrooms had already been emptied. They would find out later that many of the classrooms had heard the initial gunshots and realized instantly what the sound was. The first floor classrooms had tried to evacuate by either running to the far stairwell or jumping out the windows into the parking lot. The classroom doors had small windows in which you could see people passing outside. The classroom that was located across the gunfire had been too scared to exit into the hallway, at risk of being shot. The students were all jumping out of the windows in droves. The poor teacher was heavily pregnant, and the windows were quite narrow and only slanted slightly when they opened. It took a great deal of effort, but they got her out of the window. The students and teachers were scared for their life, not knowing if the shooter would suddenly barge into their room and begin shooting as they tried to exit. My dad eventually located a classroom that had not been evacuated. He ran over to the teacher and explained the situation. He then spoke to the students and told them, "You need to exit the school right now. Don't take your belongings. Don't go to the bathroom. Don't talk to anyone. As quietly as you can, take the far stairwell and don't look behind you. Go now." My dad is likely one of the most laid-back individuals you could ever meet. The students knew this and listened closely, knowing the situation was dire. Everyone rushed to the far stairwell, away from the gunmen, and exited to the bus garage. Dad said that the police arrived within minutes of them emptying the building and corralled everyone over to a funeral home that was across the road from the high school. Within 30 minutes, a SWAT team arrived and had set up a perimeter both inside and outside of the school. A family member had found out about the situation and called my grandfather, my mother's father. He had rushed to the school to check on his daughter and son-in-law. As my dad was waiting with the students in the funeral home parking lot, he began to search for my mother. My father asked one of the teachers that had been in the lounge with my mom if he had seen her. He said he thought she was outside. Dad once again searched through the crowd asking if anyone had seen my mother. By this time, my grandfather had arrived and asked my father where my mom was. He said that he couldn't find her. He again asked the teacher who had been in the lounge with her, and he said, "Well, come to think of it, I remember her saying that she might hide in the closet." Everyone was terrified of what might have happened to her, since it had been close to 3 hours since the gunman had entered the building. My father and grandfather notified some of the Kentucky State Police that were on the scene. Under the watchful eyes of snipers located in the parking lot and on the roof, the KSP officers entered the school and headed for the closet they thought my mother was in. My mother said that she and the other woman could hear someone outside, and they almost died of fright. Without announcement, the doorknob was suddenly ripped from their hands, and light flooded into the closet. Not hearing a cacophony of gunfire, my mom looked up and realized there were 2 armed state troopers standing outside the closet. She said that it was probably the best sight in her entire life. There were no times for tears of joy, though. The officers told my mother and the other 2 women, "You're going to be okay, but we need to get you out of the building ASAP. We need you to rush down the hallway, and when you come into the lobby to exit, you need to run." After a count, my mother was ushered from teacher's lounge toward the high school lobby. She said when she rounded the corner, there were multiple snipers set up in the hall along with a .50 caliber machine gun pointed at the classroom where the shooter was. That day, my mother had worn a dress and heels, and she said she could remember trying to run across the grass in her heels, getting stuck in the soil. She kept running through until she joined the others in the funeral home parking lot. The initial takeover had begun around 9:50 a.m. during the first block of classes. The shooter had entered the school with 3 guns, 1 shotgun, a .357 pistol, and a .44 caliber Magnum, and walked into his first block class. Upon entering the classroom, he shot into the ceiling through the art classroom located above. Luckily, no one was hit by a bullet or debris of the initial shot. He released 2 rows of students and the teacher before settling in for a standoff. The woman that initially told everyone in the teacher's lounge about the shooting had been the teacher released from the classroom. Over the next few hours, students were released for small requests like cigarettes, soft drinks, and pizza. Multiple shots were fired throughout the ordeal, but thankfully no one was injured or killed. The shooter was later identified as a 17-year-old student at the high school, advised police that he would surrender if he could see his father. He told police that he hadn't seen his father since he was 4 years old. Around 5 p.m. that day, the last hostage was released. The Kentucky State Police eventually negotiated his surrender before his father could arrive from Florida. While most people never know the reason behind such an insane act of violence, upon questioning, the shooter referred to the Stephen King book Rage as his inspiration for the shooting. Crazy enough, my dad didn't think the student served any prison time. It was his belief that while the boy was initially taken to jail after surrendering, he was never tried and was instead released out of the county and told to never return. I guess 1989 was a different time. My dad says that word had quickly spread after the takeover, and that many parents had arrived to the scene and were looking for their children. One of them asked my father where his son was, and my dad wasn't for sure, and that's what he told the parent. However, he had been too afraid to tell him that he thought he was currently being held hostage. It turns out he was. Many of the students held hostage suffered from PTSD and had to undergo counseling for many years. Fortunately, no one was physically harmed, though. Once my parents were finally released from the scene, they had driven straight to my babysitters to pick me up. Being less than a year old, I was oblivious to the chaos that my parents had experienced that day. They say when they saw me, they picked me up and prayed that the little girl would never have to experience anything like that.
If you really like my content and want to support me, please like this video and click the subscribe button. It helps me to grow my channel and is essential in reaching a wider audience. Most of you watching my videos aren't subscribed to my channel, and that's why my animations can't reach their full potential. They aren't recommended to more people who would surely love my content as much as you do. You can always unsubscribe at any moment. Thank you in advance, and enjoy the rest of the video.
When I was a senior in high school, during my last spring semester, I had taken all of the classes that I needed to take, and I had an extra hour during the day that I could use to just study. I had an entire classroom to myself for studying, but I would usually just play games on my phone. It was during my third period, so I couldn't go home early or anything like that, but it was still a nice break for me. One day, I got to my study hour and actually had some homework to do. I began working and went for about 20 minutes until I heard an announcement come over the school intercom. It was an announcement of a lockdown, and everyone was instructed to lock their doors and return to their classrooms if they were not in them. I wasn't quite sure if this was a drill or not at first, so I went over and shut the door. The classroom that I was in a wing of the school that was farthest from the locker commons and cafeteria, so I figured no teachers would come over there or hear anything. So I just went back to my homework. I will admit though, I was slightly scared, but really I thought nothing of it, because in my time at that high school, we had had 2 previous lockdowns, which were basically just false alarms. I was working on my homework when suddenly I heard a knocking at the door. I walked over to the door and saw a kid outside. I opened the door and he told me he had seen a guy in the hallway. The kid seemed to be in a panic, so I let him in the room and we locked the door. The kid explained to me that he went out for a drink of water and saw an older-looking creepy guy walking towards him. The kid wasn't able to get back to his original classroom because he would have to go past the creepy guy. I turned off the lights in the classroom and we both went to the back corner. We sat there in pitch-black silence for several minutes. I whispered over to the kid and asked him what his name was, but he appeared to be gone. Then there was another knocking at the door to the classroom. I was pretty scared at this point, but I slowly got up and walked over to the door. I listened on the other side and heard someone say police. I was shocked. I opened up the door to see several officers. One of them pulled me out of the room immediately. I was as confused as can be, but then I saw them go into the room and a short time later come out with the kid that I had let in. They led him away and they told me that he had been the reason for the lockdown. As it turns out, he was a former student who had graduated 2 years earlier. He had gone to the school and had made several threats against the school, but was seen by a staff member shortly after entering. It really creeped me out knowing I had been alone in a classroom with him. This story happened my senior year of high school, which was about 5 years ago now. That year, they added this new room at the back part of the school. I can't remember the exact name they used for the room, but it was basically just an area with several computers and tables, and it was used for giving students extra help with school or making up tests and things like that. It had been made out of an old abandoned classroom that wasn't used for several years. At this time, I had been out of school for 2 days with an ear infection, and in that time, I missed a math test. When I returned to the math teacher, he allowed me to make up the test during study hall, so I went to that new room to take it. The teacher, Mr. Marcus, didn't want to have to go to the room and watch me take the test, so he let me go by myself and said he trusted me not to cheat. I walked all the way over to the room, which was pretty much on the complete opposite end of the school, and once I got to the room, I sat down and began the test. It wasn't too long of a test, but it was a really important one. Right when I got to the third question, the telephone in the room started ringing. I didn't want to get up and answer it, but I figured it was probably Mr. Marcus. I walked over and picked it up. When I did, I was told we were under a lockdown and there was a suspicious person in the building. I was scared being all by myself back in this room with nobody else there, and there wasn't even a classroom next to me I could go to, because this classroom was between 2 locker rooms for the gym, which was also nearby. I did what I was instructed to do and shut the door. As I did, I decided to take a quick look out into the hallway. It was completely empty and quiet as well. I went back in and decided to turn off the lights. I went out of sight of the door and went towards the back. Then I took out my phone and used the screen to give me some light to try to do more questions of the test. However, I couldn't really focus with us being in a lockdown. Suddenly, I heard the door to the room that I was in open. It was at that moment that I remembered I hadn't locked the door. Quickly, I ducked down underneath the table that I was at. I could see just barely from under the table a small amount of light coming in from the doorway and saw boots on the ground. At least they appeared to be boots, as I couldn't really see much. I was terrified, and I held my breath so that I wouldn't make a sound. Whoever was in there stood in the doorway for a while, and then the door shut. I barely heard footsteps walking into the room. I was literally shaking, trying not to make a sound. The room then went completely silent and remained that way. I slowly breathed in and out as quietly as I could. I was expecting at any moment to feel someone grab me from behind or something like that. But then, out of nowhere, I heard the sound of a computer falling off a desk to the ground. Then I heard the noise of a man yelling and screaming. It seemed as though whoever was in this room had gone into a rage and was screaming and smashing things. I opened my eyes and looked over. I still couldn't really see anything, but I could hear where all the noise was coming from, and it was at the opposite end of the classroom to my left. I was terrified and knew I needed to get out of there. The exit was directly in front of me and to the right, and the noises were directly in front of me to the left, so I figured I had to make a run for it. I took a deep breath, and then got out from under the desk and ran as fast as I could, as whoever was in there continued to seemingly destroy things in the room. I ran forward to the door and was just barely able to see where I was going. I stumbled into a chair just before the door, but I was still able to make it out. I heard the man yelling as I left the room and sprinted down the hallway. I ran all the way to the front end of the school, where I saw a police officer. I yelled where the guy was and that he was destroying things. Another officer led me out of the school. After some time, I was able to calm down and they ended up catching the man. I got to go home right after that, and I feel so lucky that I made it out of that room, because obviously whoever was in there was very dangerous. In my freshman year of high school, during the first semester, I had a civics class as my last class of the day. The school that I went to was pretty average size, I would say. I remember the class that I was in had about 20 kids in it. It was a couple of months into the school year at this point, and on this Thursday afternoon, we were all just listening to the teacher go through some announcements, when suddenly the phone in the classroom rang. The teacher, Mrs. Lindstrom, walked over and answered it. Then she hung up and told us all that the school was going under a lockdown. She seemed pretty serious and told us that this was not a drill. She locked her classroom door and then turned out the lights and instructed us to the back end of the classroom. We all got up from our desks and went to the back. There was a lot of whispering going on, but nobody seemed to know why we were under a lockdown. The longer we all sat back there, the more concerned everyone seemed to get, which made me start to worry. I started thinking of all the possibilities of what could be going on. It got really quiet after a while, and at one point we heard footsteps going down the hallway, but we didn't know whose they were. The lockdown went on for probably 30 more minutes before there was another call to the classroom announcing that the lockdown had been ended. We returned to class for the final 15 minutes or so, but the only thing on my mind was what could have caused it. School was dismissed after that, and I left school to get on my bus. When I got outside the school, I noticed several police cars with flashing lights. Everyone was talking about the lockdown, and I heard several rumors about what it was. But it wasn't until later that night where I got the real answer. My friend Robbie, whose mother worked at the school, told me that the lockdown had been caused by a student who claimed to see a strange man wandering the halls. However, after an extensive search of the school, one of the back doors was seen to be open, and it was determined that the man had left. The area was briefly searched, but the man was never found. The next day, when I went back to school, everything seemed to be pretty normal. By the time I got to third hour, I had forgotten all about what had happened the day before. It was a Friday, so I was pretty much just excited to go to the football game that night. In the middle of my third hour class, which was history, I had to go to the bathroom. I knew the teacher was one of the nicer ones who didn't require a pass or anything, so I just asked and she allowed me to go. I walked down the halls of the bathrooms, which are towards the end. As soon as I opened the door and got inside, I came face to face with a man who I had never seen before. He was wearing a winter hat and had long black hair and a small beard. He looked really surprised to see me. We both stood there staring at each other for a second or two. Then the man came towards me and I turned and ran. I ran back to class, When I got back, I told my teacher what I had seen, and the school once again went on another lockdown. This time we stayed locked down for over an hour. I was terrified, but finally it ended, and afterwards everyone was allowed to go home early. They told us the man had finally been caught, but what I don't understand is how they didn't find him the first time the school was locked down, and what he was doing inside there in the first place. In high school, when I was a junior, I took a psychology class. It was my second period of the day. I liked the class, and one of the best things about it was that we were able to take open book tests. The teacher was really chill and let us work together on stuff, including the tests. We also had an option to take the tests in study rooms, which I always did, because it was much more quiet and I just felt more comfortable in there. I was the only person in the class who did this though, because you needed a pass and the study rooms were all the way in the basement of the school. I guess most students just found that a hassle and would rather work with each other as well. Anyways, one particular Friday, when we had a test to take, I did the usual thing, which was to get the test from the teacher and then go down to the study room. It took me about 5 minutes to get down there. There wasn't a whole lot at all on that level of the school. Pretty much just the study rooms and then a couple of storage rooms and some old classrooms that weren't used. I got into one of the rooms and turned on the light. The rooms had carpet floors with a table and a few chairs in each one. They also had a little window for looking out into the hallway. I began the test and searched through my psychology book for the answers. I remember I had just reached question 15 when I suddenly heard over the intercom that we were entering a lockdown. I got a little nervous, but I told myself it was probably nothing. I turned the lights off like we were instructed to, but I didn't see a lock on the door. Our school was kind of old and these study rooms were sort of outdated. I went under the desk and decided to play some games on my phone to pass the time. Several minutes went by without anything happening. Then I heard some footsteps coming down the hallway. I got really nervous knowing the footsteps likely belonged to someone that wasn't supposed to be in the school. I turned my phone off and I got really quiet. The footsteps went down towards the door of my study room. As I hid under the table, I slowly turned my head to look towards the window, and just as I did, I saw a man walk past it. All I could tell is that he was wearing a hooded sweatshirt, really. He walked past without looking in the window, but it still scared me a lot. Then I heard the door open in the room across the hall from mine, and then it shut. He must have gone in it, and at that point, I was seriously considering making a run for it. I was relatively fast, but I didn't know who this guy was. I was trying to psych myself up into running when I heard the door open once again and then shut. I buried my face into the ground and held my breath. I didn't really hear any footsteps though, so I lifted my head slightly to listen. I didn't know whether he had walked away or if he was just standing there. This made it much more risky for me to try to run away, so I decided to stay put for the time. Several minutes went by and I got more and more nervous. I decided once again I was going to try to run back upstairs, and this time I was going to actually do it. I didn't bother getting my backpack or anything, besides just my phone, wallet, and keys. I slowly crawled up the carpet to the door, and then stood up, careful not to make a sound. I then placed my hands on the doorknob. The second it started to turn, I heard it creak, and it sounded extremely loud. At that moment, I knew there was no turning back. I quickly left the room, and then headed down the hallways. Once I saw it was clear, I started sprinting towards the stairs, which were about 50 feet away. As I was running, I looked down one hallway to my right while passing by, and saw the man walking out of a room about 20 feet down the hallway. I ran even faster the rest of the ways and didn't look back. I sprinted up the stairs all the way back to my classroom. Once I got there, I pounded on the door yelling that it was me, and after about 10 seconds, I was let in. I told the teacher what had happened, and she alerted the principal. Police were able to get into the basement and locate the man, who was later found hiding in the same study room I had been in. Apparently, the man had broken into the school and beat up one of the teachers, then ran off. They had been searching the school, but hadn't made it to the basement yet. Every time I went near the basement of the school for the rest of my high school career, I would think about that day. This story happened in my freshman year of high school. I had recently moved to a new city and was unfamiliar with things. It was kind of tough for me being at a new school and having to make new friends and whatnot. One day, I had to make up a test, so I went to the history department to take it during my study hall time. And when I was done, I had to make it up to my next class, which was geography. As I was walking, I heard over the speakers that we were on a lockdown. I tried to hurry and make it to my class, but I guess it was farther away than I thought, and it took me a little longer than I expected. The hallways were already completely empty because classes were in session. I got more and more nervous the longer I was out in the hallways because I knew I wasn't supposed to be there. Then I saw a teacher come around a corner and see me. He looked surprised to see me, and I almost tried to run away, but I realized it would probably just get me in trouble. So I explained to the teacher I was just trying to get to my class. He said I shouldn't be out in the halls and that I was in trouble. He then told me to come with him, so I began to follow him down the halls. We walked to the end of the hall and down the stairs. Then he went to an exit of the school and started to walk out. I was a little surprised, but I figured maybe we were in a serious lockdown and we were supposed to leave the school. Just as we got out the door, though, the man grabbed my arm. Once he did, I got a terrible feeling. We walked a few steps into the parking lot until I heard a voice yell, "Hey," at us. Then someone yelled at the man to let me go. The man did and then took off running past the parking lot. Another teacher then rushed out to me and asked me if I was all right. I was fine, but very shocked at what had just taken place. The school stayed under a lockdown until they were able to make sure the area was clear. The school didn't have the best of security at the time, and the man had pretty much just walked right into the school. The scary part is, I don't know if he was ever caught. Years ago when I was in high school, we were having a very normal day. I was in my 5th hour class, which was my last class of the day, so I was excited to go home. It was gym class, and we happened to be outside playing Foursquare in one of the parking lots behind the school. It wasn't that long into the game when suddenly our teacher, Mr. Watson, told us all to stop our games and listen up. He announced that the school was in a lockdown, and we all needed to go inside and he would get us to a classroom. I wasn't too excited about this, and I was afraid we would be locked down until after school was supposed to get out. Mr. Watson began waving us all inside, and as he was distracted, I saw an opportunity to run away and get to my car. I know it was a dumb thing to do, but I was scared of the lockdown, and I was already outside, so I decided to make a run for it. Mr. Watson didn't even notice me leaving, and I began making my way to my car. At our high school, it costed a lot of money to park in the school parking lot, so they had a free one that was farther away that I parked at. The only problem was to get there it was maybe about a 10-minute walk, and it went through the woods a little bit. I jogged down the path and through the woods. I had to stop and start walking to catch my breath from the run. I stopped to text my best friend Casey that I had left the school and asked what the lockdown was for. As I was standing there on the path, though, I started to hear some noises coming towards me. It sounded like another person running. I figured it was another student running away like I had to go to their car. I looked into the direction of the noise, and I could see through the trees where the path curved that it was a grown man running. Immediately, I got a bad feeling, and I jumped behind a tree in the woods. The man slowed down and came around the corner. I held my breath and hoped that he wouldn't see me. He had dark hair and a goatee, and walked a ways past me. He kept looking over his shoulder, and then it sounded like he went into the woods because I heard trees and brush being moved around. Then the noises stopped. I waited there and was hoping to hear him walk away, but I heard nothing. It sounded like he had gone just inside the woods, about 30 or 40 feet down the path from where I went in. The trees were pretty thick in this area, and it was a good place to hide, but I didn't dare move or make a sound. I really just wanted to go to my car and drive away. I realized the mistake that I had made by running from class now, but it was too late to do anything about it. I sat there for a few minutes, and I knew the man was still there, but I was sure that he hadn't seen me. I debated in my mind between running back to school or trying to make a run for my car, but they both seemed pretty risky, and I didn't want to take a chance. So I remained hiding there, trying my best to stay silent, because any movement I made would make noises with all the trees and branches in there. I occasionally heard noises from where the man had gone in, pretty much confirming to me that he was still there. After what had to be at least 5 to 10 minutes of hiding, I started to hear police sirens off in the distance. They got closer and closer and seemed to be heading for the school. The sound of those sirens made me feel a little bit safer and more brave, so I then decided I was going to run back towards the school. I took a deep breath, and on the count of 3, I made a run for it back to the path towards the school. I heard the man start to move in the woods when I started running, but I couldn't tell if he was chasing after me or moving in another direction. I didn't look back at all and ran my fastest until I had made it up to the school. I saw the police officers arriving, and I ran up to one of them and told them about the man in the woods. They had me wait with some other officers for a while. The man had made a run for it, but he ended up being caught a short time later deeper into the woods. Apparently he had been trying to get into the school and had actually broken a window. My mom came and picked me up, and I had to get my car later when the area was cleared for us to return.